Creative Tech conference when Andy and I were speaking about this. And he said, oh, I love doing the 5 things because then I don't get to read the book. I just get to get the knowledge from the summaries. And I thought, right, I am not doing that because I am not going to read this book and take notes so that other people don't have to do it. This is a book you have to read, and it's the crux of what it's about. So if we can get to the first slide, please. So number 1, it has several barriers of entry that I just want to discuss, because I think what I wanted my presentation to be was a breakdown on how to make this book more accessible, because it's not an easy read. And the first thing is not easy is because it's written in transcription style. So let me see if I can get a page that I don't have notes written. So if you look at it, it's transcription style. So a lot of people will get this book and they'll think it is a self-help book, a philosophy book, something that they're going to be able to buzz through the chapters and then come away and have all this encouragement. And then they open it and they see the literary style of a conversation. And it can be a bit off-putting. I was quite shocked when I opened it and I was like, oh, what a very lazy way to write this book. But actually, it is quite clever. And that brings me to the second slide, please. And that is, to really get the most of this book, you need to read the afterword first. So when I was seeing what other people had talked, because there's lots of videos, lots of blog posts about this book and the takeaways and the highlights, and they all say the same thing, that this book is based on Adler. And it was very clear to me, they either did not read the entire book or they did not read the afterword. And so much like my favorite book, which is Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, I encourage you to read the afterword first before you read the actual book, because that will help you get the most of this book, and also will help you kind of move through the difficult concepts that the book presents. So this book is actually based on a conversation between the 2 authors, and that's Ichiro Kishimi and Fumitake Koga. Fumitake Koga was a student who in 1999 came across the Japanese interpretation of an introduction to Adler psychology. And he really enjoyed the concepts because there's a lot of self-empowerment or responsibility in the Japanese culture, self-responsibility, I guess you could say. And it was the first time he connected with a Western school of thought. And so then, but he realized that book was actually written by a philosopher, a Japanese philosopher, who is Ichiro Kishimi, and he went to speak to him. So when you perhaps get other videos or blog posts about this book, and you hear people say it follows Adler to the letter, again, I question whether they read the book thoroughly or if they read the afterword, because it's actually not completely Adler. It's, and I keep referring to the name so I don't mess it up. It's Ichiro Kishimi's interpretation of Adler. So Ichiro Kishimi has taken Adler psychology and then put it through his own filtered of lens. And so going back to the first slide, the literary style is literally Fumitake Koga speaking to Ichiro Kishimi about this book, about wanting to write this book, and they both decide that they are going to present this book in a conversational style between a young student and a philosopher. So the young student is a character alter ego of Fumitake Koga, speaking to Ichiro Kishimi about how he can be more happy in life. And it's a typical young person's, everybody in their 20s kind of deals with the same thing. You might finish your schooling, you might be let into the world, and you kind of don't have a sense of self. You don't have a firm footing of your place in the world, and you find yourself without validation a lot of times, especially if you have left school and you're entering the workforce and you're not getting that constant feedback. And so really it's about a young person who is kind of lost or unsure of himself. And that's the way the book is presented in its literary style. So the next slide, please. Now, this book requires critical thinking. It's not something you can easily just breeze through, read, because it's Adler based. And Alfred Adler is a psychotherapist who, I guess, early 20th century psychotherapist, late 19th century, perhaps, if I'm getting the dates right. Let me just check that real quick before I say something different. Yeah, early 20th century, who was very much a product of his time and had kind of, at times, a bit controversial schools of thought. So if you are someone who pays attention to birth order, whether, I'm the firstborn, so therefore I am, that is an Adler school of thought. The other sense that this book presents is that we navigate our world with a sense of inferiority, and that could help us and that could hinder us. So Adler is also the person who coined inferiority complex. Now, before I go into this a little bit more, I kind of want to tell you about how Adler died, because there's a Scottish connection. He died in 1937. He was on tour. He was doing a lectureship. He was very well known and very well respected in his time. And he was at the University of Aberdeen. And one day he just dropped dead on the street. Before he died, someone came over to him and kind of was trying to help him and loosened his collar and trying to see what was happening. And he muttered one word, which was Kurt, who was his son, Kurt Adler became a psychiatrist. And so then his body was taken to Warrington Cemetery or crematory in Edinburgh, and remains there until 2007, when it was discovered, oh my God, we have Alfred Adler's ashes here. And then it was brought to his home in 2011 for a proper burial. So I just thought that was very interesting. But Alfred Adler had a lot of controversial schools of thought, like I said, primarily on homosexuality. And again, it was a product of its time. And so a lot of the things that presents in his psychology are a bit hard to take. One of them that this book talks about is that there is no such thing as trauma. Now, when I was reading this book, I was unpacking quite a bit of well-verified, documented trauma. So when I got to that point between the student and the philosopher, and they go into an example about a young boy that's a friend of the young student, and he's presenting this as an example, who is afraid to leave his house. And then the philosopher explains the Adler school of thought, that there is no such thing as trauma. And I literally threw this book across my flat, and it remains there for several weeks until I could grasp and come to terms with this concept and want to learn about it. And one day I picked up the book and I was like, right, I'm in a better sense where I can accept, maybe not agree, but accept what this book is trying to present. And so this is what I mean by it requires critical thinking. Now, the school of thought that this book is presenting, that is also Adler psychology, is that trauma doesn't exist because the past is gone and you're in the present. So even if you believe in like woo-woo stuff like the law of attraction or The Secret, which I kind of read as trash TV for reading, it also is the same philosophy that you are now a product of who you were in your past experiences, but that does not mean that you have to continue with that train of thought. Now, I do not believe that trauma doesn't exist. However, if you allow your trauma to dictate your future, then that trauma continues to take hold of you. And that is kind of where this book is going. And it's also the crux of this book. So a lot of times people will have experiences in life and they continue to allow that to dictate their future. And what this book is presenting is to say that happened or it didn't happen, depending if you're at Adler School of Thought. And now I'm going to move forward in the way I want to be instead of the way I am, or instead of the way I was presented in the past. And so that is a bit hard to swallow if you're someone who has been through a lot of trauma, or if you have had a difficult life, or if you just don't necessarily agree with those concepts. And it's not the only concept that is difficult to take in from this book. So you might have to read this book maybe a chapter at a time. Maybe you would have to come back to it when you're in a better place if you don't like what you read. But it does require critical thinking. This is not a book you are just going to read on a Friday or Saturday night and think, oh, that was interesting, and then move on with your life. It will have thought. It should be thought-provoking. It should be reactionary. It should challenge you. And it should make you think about what you also believe in. And if you disagree, that's fine. So next slide. Because this book does require a strong sense of self. This is not a book, and it's not intended to be a book for people who, how can I put this, require hand-holding. That is exactly what this book is meant to deconstruct in you. So again, Adler comes from a school of thought of the inferiority complex. And what that means is we all feel inferior feelings, and that can either motivate us or that can deter us. For instance, if you do not believe you're very smart, you might then, if you have a strong sense of self, you might then say, right, I need more education in this certain aspects. Or if you have a weak sense of self and you feel that you are not very smart, you might then allow that to become an inferiority complex, and that will affect how you move and navigate through life. And that's what this book tries to unpack for you. It is not for someone who perhaps, well, it's not that it's not for someone, it might be difficult for someone who has a weak constitution to take on these concepts, because again, it is not Adler's school of thought psychology, and this book, even with Ichiro Kishimi's philosophy, it requires you to take a look at yourself and how you navigate through life. So for instance, the whole purpose of being free is to break away from the expectations we place on ourselves that then require us to either people please or do things that may be self-sacrifice for the sake of being well-liked. And also how we interpret the actions of others. So another school of thought of this book, which also comes from Adler psychology, is that all problems, all struggles are actually interpersonal relationships. Well, yes, no kidding. Now we would think, yeah, the world would be great if everybody was just like me, or the world would be better if I didn't have to deal with people. Well, we just have been through a pandemic where a lot of us were without people, and we know that's not the case. So what this book also, it's not the case in that we are not islands, we need people, we are humans, and we need that social bond, but different personalities, different experiences, different lens of how we view the world do cause conflict when we are required to perhaps interact with each other at times. And what this book also challenges you about is, instead of taking on other people's reactions, even if they are done towards you. So for example, if you are being screamed at by someone, this book would challenge your reactions. So a good example is what happened to me recently, where I had someone who came to me very unhappy with something that I did. Now, I knew that I was not in the wrong, and that is not me being egotistical. I was following someone else's advice to the letter, and that person didn't agree. So I was kind of like the conduit of the situation. And that because I read this book just at the same time, I was like, oh, this is a great example of how to utilize this train of thought, this lesson. And so I removed myself and not physically, not literally, but mentally. I just kind of like took a step back and allowed myself to observe this person's reactions. Now, one of the things about this book is that they say the interpersonal conflict comes from people who feel their territory is being violated. And I was able to recognize that this person clearly felt their territory was being violated. That could be a task, that could be an opinion that someone doesn't agree with, that could be you actually did do something wrong and that person was unhappy. Normally, if someone screams at you or gets angry at you or embarrasses you, you have a reaction and you take that person's emotion and then you bring it on yourself. And this book would challenge you to not do that, just to accept that person's reaction and observe it and not take it personally, which is very hard to do when someone's very upset with you. However, I was able to do that in the moment because I was like, Linda Marie, you are not the asshole in this situation. You did nothing wrong. So observe what this person is doing. And I was really happy and quite pleased that I, who am very much a reactionary person, was able to do that. And I do attribute this book because of that. And it was clear. It was very clear to me. This person felt violated by my actions, even though that wasn't my intention, even though I was just following the advice or suggestion of someone else. And it was very interesting. And then I was able to then redirect and then to see their reaction too. So again, this requires critical thought, and maybe somebody would say, I don't necessarily want to be screamed at. But when you release yourself of having the responsibility of other people's actions, or by taking on those people's reactions, then you do have a sense of freedom, which gives me to the last slide. You don't have to like this book to find value. So going back to the hard concepts, for instance, there is no trauma. So, or you're not responsible for other people's behaviors or reactions. These are hard concepts to take when you rely on other people in this world. However, the task at hand, for instance, is instead of focusing on your trauma as an example, and if you accept the concept that, right, trauma doesn't exist, which I do not agree with, but let's say I'm going to accept that for the premise of this book and for this presentation, that trauma does not exist. This book and Adler would say to focus on who you want to be in that moment and your goals and not your trauma. So going back to the example I gave you about this person who was very upset with me, and I thought, right, if I allowed my past trauma to dictate my present and to be and to influence the person I want it to be, I would react to this person. However, if I am focusing on my goals, which is what this book encourages you to do, which is what Adler would encourage you to do, then you say, who do I want to be in that situation? And in my case, I wanted to be someone who was less reactionary. And so that is a goal. And so instead of focusing on, I'm sensitive because of my past trauma, I get very upset when people are unhappy with me because of my past experiences, I am now focused future forward. And I'm going to say, right, the future self I want to present, or the person I want to be, is someone calm in the moment and not reactionary. So I'm not going to take this person's reaction personally. I'm not going to allow my past trauma to influence my current and future behavior. I'm going to focus on my goals instead. And that is a key premise of this book. Now, to sum up, people might say, well, where is the courage to be disliked? What does that have to do with this book? This book is about releasing your expectations of living your life for other people. And you can only do that when you take a good look at yourself and you focus on your goals and tasks at hand, and you do not take other people's expectations personally. So for instance, a lot of people would like to do things in life, but they are afraid of other people's reactions. They are afraid of other people's, um, they're afraid of what other people would think. And so that's the courage to be disliked. And when you see people who have the freedom, who are living their life on their own terms, for instance, women who choose not to have children, women who choose not to get married, people who choose not to have a run-of-the-mill career, who might live their life as artists, who might choose not a 9 to 5, people who live in a van as opposed to living in a house. You will have reactions from people who think, well, that's just not the way to do things. And that is the courage to be disliked. When you come to terms with your own goals of who you want to be, focusing on your future and not your past, focusing on what you want to achieve, and allowing yourself the freedom to be yourself and to not live towards other people's expectations, you will find people who don't like you. And you have to accept that. And that is the courage to be disliked. Thank you very much.